our next story, titled Fattening Up the Dogs, Justina recounts her brief foray into international diplomacy while riding in the back of a dump truck with a very diverse and very culturally diverse group of construction workers. Please welcome Justina Wu with Fattening Up the Dogs.
So when I was applying for Peace Corps and they asked me what country I wanted to go to, I told them I wanted to go to China. And the reason was because I wanted to become fluent in Chinese. Now, despite what it might look like, Chinese is not my native language. And it's not my parents' native language, it's not my grandparents' native language. I studied Chinese in school, and I studied it for 2 years, and that was it. And because I learned Chinese out of a book, my Chinese really sucked. But that's not what I told Peace Corps. I actually told them that my Chinese is really good. And I told them that I was interested in doing HIV work, and, because I knew that, China had a growing HIV problem. And Peace Corps totally bought it. They were like, you are the perfect candidate to go to an East African country called Kenya. Well, so I Googled languages of Kenya, and I found out that there's 2 national languages in Kenya. One is Swahili and one is English. And there are 68 commonly spoken languages in Kenya. And I also found out that Chinese is not one of them. So I thought, well, maybe Chinese is the 69th most commonly spoken language. And so I did what any normal person would do. I went out and bought a Lonely Planet Chinese phrasebook, and I put it in my luggage. When I got to Kenya, I was assigned to this rural, remote village called Kobujoi. It's one of those places that's so remote that most Kenyans have never heard of it. It gets rain 9 months out of the year, and there's these 2 dirt roads that crisscross the village. They're the only dirt roads that run through there. And when it rains, they just become these big mud puddles, and every vehicle that's on this road gets stuck in the mud. But one of the first things I learned when I got there was that all the locals were really excited because they were supposed to get a paved road pretty soon. So one day I'm walking along the dirt road, and it starts pouring rain. It just dumps, and within 2 minutes I'm completely soaked. I'm like soaked to the bone, and I'm cold, and I'm miserable. And then off in the distance I see somebody walking towards me. And then when he gets closer, I realize that he's a foreigner, right? And it's really weird because I was the only foreigner for like 50 miles around, at least. And then when he got even closer, I realized that not only was he a foreigner, but he was Chinese. And so, as we approach each other like this, we're like, And when he finally gets close enough, he says to me in regular Chinese, he's like, "What are you doing here?" And I say to him in bad Chinese, "I live in Kobujoi. I want to go home." And he said, "Oh, well, I live in Kobujoi, actually. Maybe I can give you a ride." And then he points down the road, and that's when I see it. It's this enormous, shiny, yellow dump truck. And he says, "I'm with the China Wuyi Construction Company. We're here paving the road." And he said, "If you want to ride, I can radio my men to come over and pick you up." At this point, I actually hesitated because in Peace Corps, we abided by the rule of when in Rome. So that meant that, I took public transportation like everyone else. If everyone was stuck in the mud, I was stuck in the mud, right? So for me to get into this fancy foreign vehicle, it just seemed like somehow a betrayal of my mission there. But then I remember that it was cold, and I was wet, and miserable, and I accepted the ride. So when I climbed into the cab of this dump truck, I realized that there were 4 other Chinese workers in there, plus their Kenyan driver. And because it's Kenya, you have to do these elaborate greetings, and so I greeted the Chinese workers in Chinese, not very elaborately, because in Chinese it's just like ni hao. And then I greeted the Kenyan guy in Swahili, like habari yako, habari gani, habari za leo, all these questions about how he was. And then at that moment I realized I was the only one in that vehicle who could actually communicate with everyone else in that vehicle. And then I started having these like idealistic fantasies. Like I was like, wait a second, I am the diplomatic bridge here. I am, like here are two cultures from opposite sides of the planet, and they've been toiling side by side for who knows how long, but in silence because they don't know how to communicate with each other, And here I am, and I can translate for them. So I turned to the Kenyan driver, and I said to him in Swahili, is there anything that you would like to ask your colleagues here? I haven't been able to ask because Chinese. I thought about it. And he was like, Hapana, hakuna kitu. And so I turned to the Chinese workers, and I said, I speak Swahili. Is there anything that you would like to ask your driver here that you haven't been able to ask him? I'm sure he must be dying to know all about him. And they thought for a minute. And one guy was like, no, but there is something that I want to tell you about him. I don't want to ask him any questions, but I need to tell you this about him. Our driver, he has really bad body odor. And that was it, right? So the rest of the ride was in silence. And when they dropped me off, one of the Chinese workers said, it's really nice to meet you. If you want, we live up the road, our camp is right up there. You should come visit us sometime. And I was actually really pleased to get this invitation, because it meant that maybe I would get a second chance to practice my Chinese. And so I went to find my best friend in the village, my Kenyan colleague, Hillary. So I was really excited about this, and I said, Hillary, tomorrow, let's go to the Chinese camp. And Hillary was a lot less excited about this. He said, so actually I've heard funny things about those people. I've heard that they eat dog meat. In fact, when we heard that all these Chinese workers were coming to our village, everyone started fattening up their best dogs because we wanted to sell them to the Chinese for food. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, they didn't want our dogs. The Chinese brought their own dogs. But they didn't bring them for food. They brought them for protection because they thought that, that we're a violent and hostile race. So, despite this, the next day I managed to drag Hillary up the road to the Chinese camp. When we got there, it didn't look like anyone was around. And so I, being nosy, I peeked through the cracks in the gate. I couldn't believe what I saw. Inside, they had washing machines. And they had ceramic flush toilets. And they had hot showers, and they had gas stoves, and they even had little gardens growing Chinese vegetables. I mean, they had essentially carved out a little slice of home in the middle of our village where most people didn't even have electricity or running water. Hillary was getting nervous, and he said, are you going to knock or what? And then I realized, I didn't know any of those workers' names that I had met the day before. I didn't know what I would say exactly if somebody came to the door, and I didn't know how to say it in Chinese. And, the truth is that I was actually feeling a bit intimidated by all these foreign comforts that they had. I lived in the community. I ate Kenyan food, I spoke Swahili, I peed in a hole, and I bathed out of a bucket, just like everyone else in the village. So I felt like an imposter, actually. Felt like an imposter who was trying to sneak her way into the land of the rich Chinese foreigners. And it's pretty ironic given that I look like this. Right? So Hillary and I walked away. We didn't knock, and we never went back. And sometimes I still wonder, maybe I missed out on an opportunity to make new friends and to practice my Chinese. But you know what? I live in the San Francisco Bay Area. There are tons of Chinese people here. Like, if one day I decide I really do want to become fluent in Chinese, I don't think it's going to be that hard.